This case has captured the fixation and fascination of the world, and I'm very curious. What is your reaction to Elizabeth Holmes testifying that she was raped at Stanford and that motivated her to pour herself in to Theranos?
Well, she didn't just testify about being raped at Stanford. She also testified that Sunny Balwani, who has also been charged in this case and will be tried separately and was the president of Theranos, repeatedly abused her in the course of their long-term romantic relationship. And that's not the typical defense you see in a fraud case.
What is the typical defense you see in a fraud case, and what makes this so unusual?
Well, the typical defense you see in a fraud case is the rest of what Elizabeth Holmes has testified to during her time on the stand, which is that she believed in the company, she relied on others, she delegated authority, and that she wasn't intentionally trying to deceive anyone, because that's ultimately what the prosecutors have to prove, not just that she deceived people, investors, patients, but that she intended to lie to people and deceive them. So her state of mind is critical, and it's quite common in fraud cases for defendants to say that they weren't trying to deceive anyone. They were themselves deceived, if anything, by other people in their organization. What isn't common is to hear testimony about the kind of sexual abuse and rape that Elizabeth Holmes has discussed on the stand.
Her attorneys have lined up a psychologist who specializes in domestic violence trauma as a potential witness. How difficult do you imagine this defense will be to pull off? And what does that signal to you about what's coming next?
Well, it's hard for me to say how difficult it'll be to pull off, because I haven't been watching the trial and I'm not in the courtroom. The jurors are hearing a lot more evidence than any of us who are learning about the trial secondhand have before us. It's an unconventional defense in a high-level fraud case, but part of the reason for that is that most high-level executives are men, so it's relatively unusual to begin with to have a high-level executive charged in a fraud case who's a woman. And then for her to argue that the jury needs to understand the intimate partner abuse that she was suffering, it's not something that we have precedent for in fraud cases, and so it's hard to know how it will play with the jury.
I mean, that of course is the big question. What other evidence, what else is the jury going to need to hear in order to make their final call, to form their opinion about what actually happened here?
Yeah, they will want to hear more evidence, and they're going to hear more evidence about exactly who was making the decisions and what Elizabeth Holmes knew when she made the representations that she made to investors and to patients. And I think the way that they assess this other set of issues, the set of issues having to do with intimate partner abuse and intimate partner violence, will depend in part on what the defense argues is the significance, what effect they say that this pattern of abuse had on Elizabeth Holmes, and also on what the jury winds up believing about the effect that the abuse had on Elizabeth Holmes' mental state.
How often do you hear the defendant testify in a case like this? You know, we didn't know whether Elizabeth Holmes would testify at all, and here she is now on her 5th day. Yeah,
well, in criminal cases generally, it's unusual for defendants to testify. I think it's more common in high-level fraud cases, partly because these are not defendants that have prior criminal convictions. And one thing that keeps a lot of defendants off the stand are rules of evidence that say that when you testify, your prior criminal record can be introduced against you. Elizabeth Holmes doesn't have to worry about a prior criminal record that will be introduced against her, and that's fairly common for defendants in high-level fraud cases. The other thing that's true about these cases is they often involve defendants who are articulate, smart, and self-confident, and they have they've gotten themselves to where they are in life in part by their ability to talk convincingly to people and they tend to put a lot of faith in their ability to talk to people, and often they have good reason to do so. So it's not as unusual in these kinds of cases as it is in the vast run of criminal cases to see a defendant take the stand and testify. To hear a defendant testify in quite personal terms about the kinds of things that Elizabeth Holmes has testified about is unusual.
So, last quick question. Does the case, is it more likely to go in the defendant's favor when they do testify or not? I mean, what does the data show?
I don't think we have good data on this. And I think it really depends on the circumstances. It depends on what the other evidence in the case suggests, how convincing the defendant is on the stand, and how convincing the prosecutors are in rebutting what the defendant has said on the stand.